So in previous sections, we've talked about generating configurations from templates, and this includes both partial configurations and full configurations. Now let's look at coupling the creation of the configuration files from the template and pushing either part of the configs using Ansible core modules or pushing entire configs using Napalm. And obviously with Napalm, we could also do partial config pushes as well. So if we look at this example that I have right here, we saw basically the same example or a very similar example to this earlier. So we're going to generate the configurations for some name servers. So that part of the config pertaining to name servers. We're going to do this for Cisco, iOS boxes, NXOS boxes, and Arista. We're going to start out, we're going to delete the old config files. Basically, I don't want any stale configuration files sitting there, so I'm going to delete them. I use the Ansible file module to accomplish that. I then regenerate the config files. So I'm going to use this GenDNS template. We're going to populate whatever we need to populate in there, and then we're going to generate these output files in the configs directory. And the GenDNS template just looks like this. So if it's iOS, it uses this. If it's EOS, it does this. If it's NXOS, it does that. All those files get generated into the configs directory. And then at this point, we're going to start pushing those configs. So we'll push the configs to iOS, we'll push the configs to NXOS, we'll push the configs to Arista. Each case, we're just using Ansible core modules, and we had to make 3 separate plays because we need one for each of the respective platforms. Now let's just use NetMiko grep to look at the name server config on the Cisco devices, and then we'll look at it on the NXOS devices. We're going to verify that we're actually making some changes here. And actually, I'm going to look on Arista. And let me double check the Arista configs that we're going to generate. Okay, so it looks like Cisco iOS already has it, but Arista does not already have those configuration items. So let's try to push this out and see what happens. And for grins, I'll look in my configs directory. I'll remove everything in there. So we're going to make sure that we're generating all these files. Okay. So we're generating our playbooks, we're executing our playbooks, we're generating those configuration files there, and now we're pushing them out. iOS config, so the iOS devices are already correct. The NXOS devices are already correct. And then let's finally look at the 4 Arista switches. And at this point, we are configuring the 4 Arista switches. We see we made a change there, and now let's query the 4 Arista switches and see if we have those 2 name servers properly configured. And there we see we come back with each of the 2 name servers on the 4 Arista switches, switch 5, switch 6, switch 7, and switch 8. Now, if we may move one step farther and say, let's look at pushing full configurations to devices. So here I have an example where I'm going to push full configurations. Once again, I start by making sure that my config files are deleted, that they don't exist. Basically, I want to ensure that there's no stale config files. Notice here I'm operating on the Arista group. I'm going to use this Arista genconfig.j2 template, and I'm going to generate those configs. This template is basically the same as what we had seen at the end of our video on generating full config files. So we're basically have a whole bunch of elements in Jinja 2 template or Jinja 2 templating, and we're populating all these variables from our inventory system and generating the full configs. Go back into the playbook. We then have one additional item. We're going to use the Napalm install config. We're using this Napalm credential provider for all the platforms. That is stored in my group vars. So it's in arista.yml inside of group vars. We're then going to be loading this config file. Now at this point, I don't actually want to be committing the changes, so I'm going to toggle that to false. Replace config is true, so this is an entire replace, and then we'll diff everything. Okay, so once again, we'll look at our configs. I'm going to do remove all those. We'll look at our diffs. I'm going to remove all those. Now there's nothing there. One last check to make sure. Okay, commit changes is false. So we will go ahead and execute our playbook. So we're gathering facts, we deleted the old configs, we generated the new configs. Now here we are not committing the changes, we are just doing a diff to see what's going to change. There we see our diffs came back, and we look at the diff output, and let's look at it for each of these. So basically it's going to remove the name servers that we just configured. So we had just configured these in that previous step, and now we are going to go ahead and remove them with this full config replace operation. And since we're doing a full config replace, I'm just going to sanity check each of the 4 files. Make sure it all looks correct. It does. If we go back to our NetMiko grep, we know that we had seen that this is currently configured on the 4 Arista switches. We'll just verify it, make sure everything is still there. Then we'll toggle the commit option and push out the changes, which is going to remove those name servers. So we are pushing the entire configurations that we generated from that templating system. And there's only one small difference between our generated configs and what's already on the box. So at this point, it's trying to push it to all 4. We see that it executed correctly. Now if we repeat our NetMiko grep, we can see what comes back with our name server. And we'll see if we verify that, and it does come back correctly. Now when we get to this point, we're in a very nice position, because if we need to update anything on the Arista config, we can just go back to our template and modify the template and regenerate whatever it is we want new. So say we wanted to add a second NTP server, an NTP2 variable is already defined in my variables. I can do this, and now since I made the change in the template, it's going to get generated on all 4 of those devices, and then ultimately it would get pushed out. So if I toggle this back to commit changes false, re-execute our playbook, and now when we look at our diffs, we're going to see that it's basically the pending change is going to be to add a second name server to the 4 Arista switches. But you can see how you can have a templated system, which makes it much easier to make changes to your devices. If we go and look at this and look at switch 5, we can see we're adding a name server, and then let's try switch 7. We can see we are also adding a name server.